Well, welcome back, everybody. In this video, we're going to talk about Israel conquering the land of Canaan. And this isn't so much, again, about Israel versus the Canaanites who are occupying the land, but this is about God's battle. This is about God's plan, keeping his promises. Sometimes the Israelites are just merely spectators. Other times, the Israelites support God and obey God. So this is a series of stories that we find in Joshua 6 through 12. And what the author does is he tells really three series of stories. A series of stories about the central area and the southern area and the northern area. But we have to remember that this isn't just pure history, like a videotape, but rather this is theological history. In fact, in the Jewish canon, the book of Joshua is referred to as a former prophet. It's sort of a prophetic book. And what the prophets do is that they remind the people about God's law, about God's covenant, and the importance of obedience, and that if they obey, they'll get blessed. And then when the people disobey, a prophet calls the people to repentance and warns them about judgment that will come if they continue in their disobedience. So that's kind of what Joshua is doing in this book. He's functioning as a prophet, talking about obedience and disobedience. And remember, that's really the issue in these history books. Will the people of Israel obey God and be blessed and then in turn bless the nations? Or will they disobey God and lose that opportunity to bless the nations? So the author of the book of Joshua tells us stories about the conquest in each of these areas, southern, central, and northern. And what the author does is sort of gives two examples in each area, one example of obedience and one example of disobedience. Because remember, that's the point of the whole book. And the author is telling the people of Israel and telling us that when we obey God, it's good for us and it's good for God's redemptive plan. But when we disobey God, then we're working sort of against God and his plan to bless the world. So let's look at these three areas and these examples. The first one is the central campaign in chapters 6 through 8. And here, the example of obedience is about the fall of Jericho. Well-known story about how the people march around the city of Jericho 7 times. They obey God, and the walls of the city fall down. A miraculous victory. But then, what the people are supposed to do as they take over these cities is that God tells them they're to devote them to the Lord, or the Hebrew word is cherem, which means that they're supposed to completely destroy everything in the city and devote it to God. And so here in Joshua 6, it says that the people devoted the city of Jericho to the Lord, and they destroyed every living thing in it, men, women, young, old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. So the people obey God. They take the city of Jericho and they destroy everything in it. Well, the story of disobedience in this central campaign involves the city of Ai and a character named Achan. Now, you can read the story here. This is a failure in the cherem, or the destroying or the devoting these things to God. The Israelites were unfaithful to the devoted things, and Achan kept some of those things rather than destroy them. And so Achan was punished. And when the Israelites went to take the city of Ai, they failed. They were unable to take it because they had been disobedient to God. So Jericho is an example of obedience, walking around the walls and miraculously winning the victory. But then Ai is an example of disobedience, because Achan kept some of the possessions to himself and didn't destroy them, and so there was failure, and he himself was killed. Just kind of an interesting thing here about these two characters, Rahab and Achan. If you remember, Rahab was a Gentile, an outsider, and she ended up being saved and part of the people of God because she obeyed. Achan, on the other hand, was an Israelite or an insider. He ended up being destroyed. So it's not a matter of being an Israelite or not. Again, it's a matter of obedience or disobedience. The stories in the central area conclude with point number 3 there. At Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, the people of Israel renew the covenant and the covenant obligations that Moses gave back in Deuteronomy 27 and 28. There you see where Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim are in relation to the central, and there's a photograph of it today. That's what it looks like today. Half of the people stood on Mount Gerizim, the other half on Mount Ebal, and they shouted back and forth. And what they were shouting back and forth were the blessings and the curses, just as it is written in the book of the Torah or in the book of Deuteronomy. So the people are reminding themselves of the blessings that come from obeying God and the curses that come from disobeying God, as they just experienced themselves. Obedience at Jericho, disobedience at Ai. So the stories in the Southern Campaign, chapters 9 and 10, are also about obedience and disobedience. Again, theological history. The example of disobedience is the so-called Gibeonite deception. Here you can read the story for yourself in Joshua 9 if you want to, but here it says that the people did not inquire of the Lord, and rather Joshua made a treaty of peace with these Gibeonite people, which meant that the Gibeonites or the Canaanites were allowed to stay in the land, and that would become a problem for the Israelites throughout their history, as the Gibeonites would have a very negative influence. So because the Israelites did not inquire and listen to God, they were defeated by the Gibeonites, an example of disobedience. Here you see that southern area in the area of Gibeon. The example of obedience in the Southern Campaign is that well-known story about when the sun stood still and the people were fighting in a battle, and God caused the sun to stand still, and the people obeyed God, and God came to their aid and helped them win the victory. So again, disobedience and obedience, that's the issue. Which one will the people choose, and then which one will we choose? This is the story of the Northern Campaign in chapter 11. There really is only one story of obedience here, and that is about the taking of the city of Hatzor. And here we read in chapter 11 about a group of kings who gathered together with a huge army as numerous as the sand on the seashore. But the people of Israel, again, obeyed God, they listened to God, and God came to their aid and helped them win the victory. The city of Hatzor was a very large city, an important military city, and because the people obeyed, God helped them. There you see where the city of Hatzor is, and that's what it looks like today, Tel Hatzor. And there it is again. So the Israelites conquered the land of Canaan. And there are 3 series of stories about obedience and disobedience. One of the issues that comes up in this section of Joshua is this idea of cherem, or holy war, killing in God's name. We remember when we saw in Jericho, when the people conquer a city, they were supposed to completely destroy it because they weren't to enrich themselves from war, but they were supposed to trust God. So God told them to kill men, women, children, animals. Now that's one of those difficult moral issues that we confront in the Old Testament. Here, this goes back even to the book of Deuteronomy. It says, when you go into the land, destroy them totally. Show them no mercy. Deuteronomy 7:16 says, you must destroy the people. Do not look on them with pity. Well, what are we supposed to make of this? This killing in God's name. It doesn't really seem like a very sensitive evangelism strategy. If you want to bless the world for God, then why would you go into Canaan and kill all these people? A difficult moral question. Well, I think we can, at least in part, answer it by saying this. Number one, this is God's judgment on the evil of the Canaanite culture. And so God was actually using the Israelites in this case to punish the sin of the Canaanites. Here in Genesis 15, God's talking to Abraham, and he says, in the 4th generation, Abraham, your descendants will come back. For the sin of the Amorites or the Canaanites has not yet reached its full measure. The idea is that now it's the 4th generation, and the Israelites have come back to the land of Canaan, and now they are executing God's judgment against the Amorites and the Canaanites, for their sin has now reached its full measure. A second thing that we can say about this is that the purity of the Israelite religion had to be preserved. If Israel really wanted to be a blessing for God on the nations of the world, they themselves had to remain faithful and pure, especially at the very beginning when they were going into Canaan, and they were going to be surrounded perhaps by all these Canaanites and the influence of the Canaanite religion upon them. Here, God says back in Deuteronomy that you got to be careful about those Canaanites because they're going to teach you to follow all the detestable things that they do in worshiping other gods and cause you to sin against God. Of course, the religion of the Canaanites was this Baal worship, worshiping this idol Baal, who was the water god, who provided water. And the worship of Baal involves sexual immorality and all kinds of terrible things. So one of the reasons that God tells the Israelites to kill the Canaanites when they go into the land is so that they will not be influenced by idol worship and the Israelites would remain pure. A third thing I think we can say here is that this is not a permanent principle. God doesn't want us just to go around killing people who disagree with us. This was meant for a particular situation at a particular time for a particular purpose. Here we can see in the New Testament, when Jesus teaches, he sort of changes that situation. He says, you have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But Jesus says, I tell you, now the rule is love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. So you can see that the revelation of God has sort of made progress. Where the Israelites were supposed to kill the Canaanites so that they could remain pure, now Jesus says, we're not supposed to kill our enemies, we're supposed to pray for them and love them. And that's the idea of progressive revelation in the Bible. Revelation makes progress. In the Old Testament, the Israelites were to eliminate the Canaanites for a particular purpose. But now in the New Testament, Jesus makes progress in that revelation and tells us that we're to love our enemies. So that's the story of Joshua 6 through 12. Examples of obedience and disobedience. Theological history.